Welcome to Flowed Conversations, where today we will celebrate and discuss Black and Brown LGBTQIA plus history. Our topic is Black and Brown LGBTQIA plus history, our past, present, and future. We are elated that you're joining us today, and I'm going to ask you to take a moment to like and share this event on your social media. This is sponsored by LGBT Faith Leaders of African Descent, which is a nonprofit that connects LGBT folks to faith, facilitates conversations that's relevant to the LGBT Black and Brown community. We are about education and we are activists. So we're elated to have you join us today for another conversation where our guest today is Dr. Anansi Wilson. I am Ryan RJ Love, and I'm the moderator today. So I'm going to ask, welcome, Dr. Anansi. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Take about a minute to introduce yourself to our audience today.
Yeah, as RJ said, I'm Dr. Anansi Wilson. Just quick background. Got a law degree, went to law school at Howard, HU, place on the hill, the Mecca. PhD in African diaspora studies from UT Austin. And I teach law, constitutional law, criminal law, critical race theory here at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. So I really styled myself as a kind of a scholar creator I do a lot of work in literary scholarship, a lot of work around race, law, and sexuality, particularly around Black queerness in the law, thinking about how the afterlives of slavery continue to affect and infect the Constitution, and particularly the ways in which the police and the state interact and see and consume Black life and Black being.
Wow, that is amazing. I love the intersectionality of your work. We welcome you, Anansi, to this space and to our audience. And you did mention, you mentioned the law, and you also mentioned Black and brown kind of rights, LGBT rights. So I want to take one moment to encourage our constituents, our audience, everyone out there. Please, this is midterm elections. Please take the time to vote, because some would take your rights away. And it's up to you to fight for your rights. So just want to mention that. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. And so for the background of our conversation, as you know, this is LGBT History Month, and which started in 1994 by Rodney Wilson, who is a Missouri high school teacher. He believed that a month should be dedicated to the celebration of teaching gay and lesbian history, and gathered other teachers and community leaders. They selected October because public schools are in session, and existing traditions such as National Coming Out Day, which is October 11th, occur during the month of October. Gay and Lesbian History Month was endorsed by GLAAD, the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, the National Education Association, and other national organizations. So in 2006, Equality Forum assumed responsibility for providing content, promotion, and resources for LGBT History Month. The LGBT community is the only community worldwide that is not taught its history at home, in public schools, or in religious institutions. LGBT History Month provides role models, builds community, and makes the civil rights statement about our extraordinary national and international contributions. So today, our discussion focuses primarily on BIPOC LGBT history, because we're Black and brown folks, and our narratives are typically erased, overlooked, or purposefully excluded when we discuss LGBT history. So the first question, where does BIPOC LGBT history commence in the USA, and why is that important? And when I think about our history, you know, I studied a little bit of history. Would you place that time period during the Reconstruction era, or possibly before then? Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, like, there's two questions within the question, right? There's a question of, you know, when are we seen, or when are we documented? It's that old thing of, you know,
Yeah.
if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it really fall in the forest, right? So I think the first answer to when are we documented, it begins with the history of William Dorsey Swann. We can talk about that a little bit more later. And that's during slavery, that's 1865, just after slavery ends. But I would say that, of course, our history begins with the beginning of the country, right? Particularly if we're talking about Black and Indigenous people, our history predates the United States. We're always here, always writing the stories, always carrying on, as we've always done. But I would say, again, that our documented history, particularly for Black queer folks, begins with William Dorsey Swann, who folks are now calling the first Black drag queen, the first drag queen in American history.
Interesting. So, because you start with the documented, and a lot of our history, just as people from Africa, a lot of our history was told in stories. So, are there any other narratives about the beginning of our history, or are there any stories, any oral histories that may precede the documented?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's interesting because even the story of William Dorsey Swann only comes out of criminal court records, right? Of them being sentenced. So essentially, I'll just tell their story really quickly. William Dorsey Swann was born to an enslaved mother in Maryland. They and their younger brother escaped when I think William was 3 and their brother was a year old, escaped into DC at the time. William was known for having a lot of balls. They called him the first Black drag queen because they would come down dressed as if they were the Queen of England, with trails coming behind their back in DC in the 1860s, right? And so they had this one ball, and apparently the police were called. And the police tried to bust in their house, and Dorsey Swann, being the bad bee that they are, throws themselves at the police down the winding stairs and says, "You cannot enter because you are no gentleman," right? In an effort to protect the men that are there for these tea parties. And William was, still in the little, the glasses and things like that for the tea parties and for the balls. And when they were arrested, when they went to court, the judge said, "You've ruined the lives of some good men, the character of some good men." Essentially, this idea that by virtue of being close to William, these straight white boys that came there, straight white boys, have now had their character ruined by contact. Like queerness is some type of infectious disease like COVID at the time. And the judge sentenced them to 10 years in jail. And the judge says, "If I could, I would like to rid the city of all of your kind, all of your type." So that's the first time we see documented when it comes to Black folks, really, of this notion of like the policing of the Black queer body and the Black queer body itself being seen as an unnatural, ungodly, devious kind of contagion, right? And if it gets too close, you might just catch it, So it's interesting. Very interesting. But to answer your question specifically, there is a lot of oral history about Black queer folk existing, particularly during slavery. But the problem with these kind of slave tales is like, you don't know if the folks are queer or if they were just sexually assaulted. And that is kind of like the evilness of it all, right? And then the second issue of that, of course, is if you're thinking about the United States in that time, it's still illegal to be queer. It only became legal to have same-sex relations in 2006. Right? I'm sorry, 2003. So if you think about it like that, it's no wonder that the oral traditions in and of themselves are disappeared. Because to have an oral tradition means to self-identify. And to self-identify means to admit that you are a crime. And to do that means to open yourselves up not only to the anti-Blackness of the law, but this kind of religious zeal of persecuting and burning at the stake and raping and other things to gay folks at the time.
Wow. I didn't expect to hear that the history started so early. So the next question is, I'm going to move in this direction. So we're talking about a specific history. Mm-hmm. Now, what about, is there a specific time and place when maybe Black and brown queer movements may have happened in the US?
Yeah, so again, this is also like I'm going to keep saying these are complicated questions, right? Another complicated question and answer. So even to go back to your previous question about where do Black queer people, because I have to go back even further because I'm remembering some of the colonial laws that predate the United States and predate slavery in the 1500s, the ways that Black folk, whether they were indentured servants, enslaved, or free, were punished much differently than white people that were accused of being queer, like in the 1500s, late 1550s, 60s. So there's also that's happening there. But as far as movements, it seems that people have always been kind of agitating for their freedom and for their acceptance in society. So you see that as early as the 1500s and 1600s. But you really don't see this kind of organized movement around being Black and queer, Latinx and queer, until really, I would say, late 1800s, 1920s, Harlem Renaissance times. But then it comes out in full force, right, in the 60s with Stonewall. And then it gets a little bit more wild in the 80s and 90s with Essex Hemphill and Act Up, Fight AIDS, right? The kind of second Harlem Renaissance. So things kind of come in ebbs and flows. But if you look at our timeline, it almost seems as if Black queer movements for our freedom track very closely with Black movements for freedom writ large. So if you think about the first time where Black people were kind of showing their face a little bit, it's also around the time when you get that first push for the first Civil Rights Act, right, in the 1880s. So there's a lot of movement going on, and it seems that once somebody in our community wants free, everybody wants free as well. They may think at the time that queerness is contagious, but it seems that freedom is the contagion you really got to worry about.
Yes, I love that. I love that point. So you mentioned several different points of history. So my question is, can you again, kind of in sequential order,
Mhm.
um, mention several milestones that are important to the Black and Brown LGBT history, whether it's global or specifically in this country?
Yeah, I would say that, I think what's foundational for us, particularly in this country, even though people don't see this as like black and brown queer history, is the ending of slavery, right? Because the ending of slavery does something beyond saying that black folks can be owned as property. What it really does, it plants a seed, particularly in the legal world and also in black folks' mind, that you actually own your own body. Well, there's this notion now that the government cannot, or at least should not, be passing laws that regulate what you do with your body, because so much of slavery was about control of the reproductive acts of black men and women, whether they were queer or not. Queer wasn't even a word at the time, really, right? There were different ways that they called and named and made fun of particular ways, but people were forced to have children, whether their sexuality was not a question, it didn't matter, right? So I would say the ending of slavery is really something that we have to kind of begin to reckon with. And it also means, after slavery, you started to see some of these kind of things that I would say maybe are like pre-houses or pre-ballroom scene, where you have, in almost a William Dorsey Swan situation, you have folks having these particular type of hideaway, juke joint, queer spaces, right, to find folks that they love. Right. And to also escape the kind of crazy gaze of the Black church at that time. So there's a lot going on. So I think that Reconstruction was huge because folks are actually starting to get their own money. They can move around. You had this great migration from the South up to New York, the first great migration in the I would say, well, right after slavery, 60s, but then in the 80s again. But I think the biggest thing that we got really in the beginning, as far as like a formative thing, was the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance, right? You start having these images of Black queer folk looking dashing, not only looking dashing, but looking like the best folk in the Black community, right? Look at these folks, right? And not only that, you're seeing queer people emerge as people of letters, people of the arts, and being celebrated for it. And not just celebrated for the fact that they can write well or do beautiful poems or play, the trumpet or cornet very well. But the idea is that they're telling these stories that are significant, not only to the nation, but goes to the truth of the matter of Black living, dying, and joy, right? In the ways that other Black folks have not yet done this. So Black queer people start to become indispensable, even if folks want to turn a side eye at us because who we love and how we love. So the 20s are huge, right? And then we come into the 60s. We get people like Jimmy Baldwin over here, ancestor, James Baldwin, who becomes a voice not just of African Americans, but of America as a whole and a conscious of the country, right? You see Bayard Rustin, right, who's organizing the March on Washington and several other marches, and then is pushed aside because he's so-called caught having sex in his car, Bing operation, right? So we see all these moments, and of course there's Stonewall with Marsha and others talking about, look, you're not gonna put your hands on me, baby, right? Here, take this heel and take this book, take this stone, right? And so we see all these very important movements. And then I would say the last big movement, besides obviously the recent ones of same-sex marriage and housing discrimination, sex discrimination, the Supreme Court case that came out last year, Bostock, that essentially said that discrimination based upon sex, well, homophobic discrimination is basically discrimination based upon sex, which is part of the Civil Rights Act. So they kind of wormholed us in there, which I think is huge because now you can't be fired for being a male who decides to wear a dress to work or for being transgender, right? Because that's sex discrimination, which is amazing that was kind of put in. But to go back to the chronology that you talked about, I would say that the 90s are obviously huge with the fight and the rebellions against the kind of, so-called gay-related immunodeficiency disease, Ronald Reagan's kind of slow attack on Black queer people that are struggling against or living with HIV or AIDS at the time. So that was also huge. That second renaissance that comes from Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill and Marlon Riggs and others that are doing this beautiful art, but also, again, showing the dirty, gritty underbelly of the American life or the American lie or the American daydream, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, in 2003, we get the Supreme Court case, Lawrence versus Texas, which essentially says that you have the right to have consensual sex with any adult that you please, right? It's just like, wow, actually bodily autonomy And very quickly, I don't want to ramble on too much, but that case is important, and people forget to look at it because of also the racial issues that happen. So the case, the way white folks like to tell it is, Mr. Lawrence was so bold. The police kicked into his house while he was so-called having sex allegedly, and he sued the police. He sued Texas, and he got us this right. And that's not what happened. What happened was Lawrence was trying to entertain a brother named Tyrone Gardner, and Tyrone's ex-lover was also there and was jealous. So what did he do when he thought Lawrence and Tyrone were having sex? He went outside and he did the Karen thing. He called the police and he said, there's a Black man here with a gun and he's broken into an apartment. And so the way these queer rights have come into being oftentimes are through anti-Black queer, particularly manifestations of white desire, right? And so this white man pulled a barbecue Becky because he thought Tyrone was exercising bodily autonomy. But that exorcism of that practice of bodily autonomy then broke open the gates, right, for white people to be able to do the same thing, to have bodily autonomy. So it's really, really interesting how Black practices of freedom are oftentimes what gets us killed, gets us arrested, and Tyrone went to jail for a bit, and gets us discarded. But it also opens up a portal of freedom practices for everybody else.
That's fascinating because when you were talking about the milestones, what I started noticing is how Black freedom and LGBT freedom seem to go hand in hand, but also anti-Blackness and then anti-queerness historically. And so the fact that you mentioned this case and it shows how they are intertwined.
That's right.
That is really, really fascinating. I love that these movements are, it seems to me in the way I conceptualize it's about an expanding sense of agency. And so when I think of agency, I kind of think of some of the things that I experienced in growing up as, a Black cisgender male Christian from the South, and how it's new to me, this sense of agency. And that's kind of what I have kind of longed for. So I love that we're talking about this in this space from a historical perspective, but we're also going to bring it to the present and then the future. So thank you. This is rich.
I love what you're saying about agency as almost an inheritance. It's something, right? This idea that this is like a carry-on tradition that your ancestors, your queer ancestors, those you may not be connected to by blood, but that you're connected to by custom and way of being, have gifted you something that they've been longing for. It's a beautiful conception.
And even as you say that, I love the historical ancestry, but then I think about colonialism and how our community, the actual opposite, how our community has taken freedoms and kind of has oppressed itself or specific members, the least of these, if you will, how parts of the Black and brown communities have oppressed women, have oppressed, anyone that's not of the heteronormative, that doesn't fit the norm. So yes, thank you for bringing that.
It's interesting. It's been, even as, they've attempted to oppress and suppress us, and even as violent and deadly and bloody as it's been a wild failure. We just keep coming back with more. Not only do we come back with more, we lead them to freedom. There's no movement in American history for freedom without a Black queer person near the front or at the front of it. Here we are. It's something else.
And it is true that the least of these, like if I typically think about women kind of being the mule of society, but when they fight, everybody else wins. And it's the same thing with the LGBT community. When we fight and win, everybody else
wins.
Benefits.
Come on, equity. Yes.
This is so rich. So I'm wondering specifically about the Harlem Renaissance. how does LGBT history, and I know you've mentioned some characters, you mentioned the Harlem Renaissance, you talked about the artistries, you talked about the clothing, and I think of this is when I think of the Harlem Renaissance, I think of this Black brilliance.
That's right.
The first time that we can really shine after, and that may not be historically correct. I'm not a historian, but I think of it because not only do we have Harlem, but we have Raleigh Durham, we have cities throughout the country, but Harlem is known as the pinnacle because of Black wealth, because of the artistry, because of the music, all of that. So how does LGBT history and or LGBT figures intersect with Harlem Renaissance, which is known as an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, literature, theater, politics, which is all centered in Harlem, in New York. And this took place during the 1920s and the 1930s. So how does LGBT history and the Harlem Renaissance intersect?
Well, I think that, like, LGBT people, queer folk, Black queer folk, are to the Harlem Renaissance what hip hop is to music, right? Or what Black people are to the music industry, right? It's the soul, it's the nexus. There's nothing without it. And so when we talk about, the Harlem Renaissance, we've already mentioned Langston and County and countless others, but we're also talking about folks like Ma Rainey, right? We're also talking about Betsy. We're talking about Black queer women that are in this space too, or folks that may identify with gender at the time because there's not a language to talk about or existing outside of gender. But if you think about it, you have a lot of poor Black folks, right, that have come into New York and are very, very poor and are creating culture. And the wealth follows them oftentimes. And that's not to say that many of these Black folks did not become wealthy or weren't wealthy. We know what went on, I can't even think of sister's name. Talking about Madam C.J. Walker and others, yes, that have this like wealth, right? And do these amazing things and become patrons of Langston and others. So I think when we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance and LGBT history, we're never talking about two separate things. And I think what Black folks forget is that I would say almost all the folks in the Renaissance that we're concerned with that made an impact were queer folks. And many of them were bisexual, and we don't think about bisexual people historically, right, as being a part of the LGBT community. We generally think about folks that are either we understand to be trans now or non-binary now. We think about gay folks and we think about lesbians, but we don't think about someone bi because as soon as we see them with the so-called opposite sex, we count them as straight. Right. So I think that's the kind of discounted thing that happens there. But the Harlem Renaissance and Harlem itself is not only a site of music making and art making, but it's a site of longing and it's a site of the practice of freedom. And it acts as a beacon, just as it did then. And then and again in the 90s, we see with the remake of TV shows like Pose, right? We're not to remake the installation with shows like that, but also as it does today for kids in the South that are stressed out about getting kicked out of their house because they're queer. Where do people run off to? New York or Chicago. These types of places that become sites and beacons and models of what it means, to your point, RJ, right, to exercise not only bodily autonomy, but also exercise autonomy over our spirit. The idea that you can control, right, the things that are in your surrounding and you can control what you have to deal with and consume intellectually and spiritually and emotionally day to day. And that, I think, is the true essence of the Harlem Renaissance. It's this idea that Black folks only been free for 60 years, right? And not truly free then because you have the backlash to Reconstruction with the KKK running loose throughout the country. But as soon as Black folks get a little taste of freedom, look at what they've conjured. Look at what they've done. And to your point, not just Black folks, but the so-called least among Black folks, right? Look at what they've done, because when you're at the bottom, you're closest to the earth and nature, and you're able to create something and plant something and conjure something new. And that's what they did. And I think that's the beauty of the Harlem Renaissance. It's a homecoming of sorts. It's a conjure work.
Yes, so eloquently stated. You said a lot. You said
You keep asking these complicated questions. I see what you're doing there.
You're the scholar.
I was trying to set me up. Hold on, let me think about this. What was that?
So you brought a few points wonderful, complex points out. And I want to, you know, I want to highlight maybe two of them. One is that going back to the beginning of this conversation
Mhm.
was that we LGBT,
Mhm.
Black,
Mhm.
and brown people have been here forever.
That's right.
This is not new. It did not happen, negatively in response to anything. No, you were born in wonderful Black brilliance with sexual freedom.
That's
I
right.
just have to state this for um, those who are watching, those who are listening, because I've heard different narratives, in the street, depending on, if you listen to the Hebrew Israelites, if you listen to some others, they want to say this is a result, LGBT
That's right.
is a result of colonialism. No, we precede colonialism. So that's one point. Like, you are perfect. You are brilliant in your LGBT
That's right.
status, expression, whatever.
Yep. Sorry, I just pulled up this quote. So I remember that. Here it is. Okay. So Maya Angelou once said in her interview, right, she doesn't get nervous when she goes into meetings, when she walks into boardrooms, when she gives her speeches anymore, because she said, I come as one, right, but I stand as 10,000. And noting all the ancestors that had to live and die and toil on for her existence. And I think as Black queer folk, right, and I say that not like Black comma queer, but I spell it in one word and I coined the term BLAQUEER, right? The capital Q and the capital B, because like these things don't exist separately, right? We have our ancestors too. And we forget that even though we're queer, we too stand as 10,000. And to your point, I think it's important that we remember those moments, that we have a legacy and we have a future. And tomorrow, we are the legacy of the children that come next. And we forget that way too often.
Ooh, yes, I love it. I'm overjoyed. There's one more point I'm gonna make, and you reiterated it in part, the Black queer together.
Yeah.
When you mentioned spirituality, I immediately thought of wholeness, the mind, the body, and the spirit. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the fullness of our personhood, of our humanity, of our agency. Like, we are whole as we are. We don't have to be splintered. We don't have to be fractured. It's not Black versus your faith. It's not your LGBT versus your Blackness. Your LGBT, Black, and your faith, whatever that is.
Yeah.
So I love the richness of that, and even that's one thing that our organization strives to be inclusive of the whole person, whatever their faith is, and to reconnect, because so often it's told to that you can't, God doesn't love you because you're LGBT. You can't have a relationship with God because of your sexuality. And no, that is false. So I wanted to bring that, full circle. I love the magic in how you communicated that.
That's amazing. It's so funny. I feel like you've been stalking me now. So my first book is it's called Godless Circumcisions, a recollected remembering of Blackness, queerness, and flows of survivance. And on the cover there's 3 different versions of me. And I was in law school when I wrote this. So there's the one with the suits and the high top fade. And then there's the tank top with the cornrows, and then there's like a little bikini with my hoops in and my mohawk. And they're all holding hands together. And that what they're holding is like this bloody scalpel, right? And it's this idea, right, that throughout all of our lives, and I think this is for all of humanity, really, particularly for folks of color, BIPOC folks, but especially for Black queer folks, is that every room we go into, we're expected to circumcise and swallow a piece of ourselves. We're expected to cut away parts of our flesh. And at that time, for me, I think I was 25 when I wrote this, like 6 or 7 years ago. I realized, I was like, wait, I can't do this. And what I need is wholeness. And these circumcisions are godless. right? So what does it mean to remember? And not just remember as in to not forget and to take it back, but to actually read separately, like a dash, and member, to bring that piece of you back. So it's a member of your body again, a member of your soul again. And then what does it mean to recollect the things that were stolen from you? Right. And so when I wrote that book, it was just like, I'm in law school, I'm going crazy. These rich black people at Howard Law, they don't. I come from the projects. I don't know what they talk about. They're talking about my people, right? And so I had to go away to Africa for like 6 months, and I was like, I have to get my life back in order. And when I touched that soil, I'm telling you, ancestors are so real. But I touched that soil, and I was so inspired to write this book. And so it's a collection of essays, poems, and kind of cultural critiques and affirmations. So when you were talking about wholeness, the first 3 words in the introduction was like, we were whole, nothing was missing. And so it's so crazy that you brought that up. I'm like, come on, Synergy. Hey, look at you really connected.
The brilliance is magnetic.
Okay.
So you're putting it out.
Come on, community. This was best like in the Harlem Renaissance. Come on now.
So I want to take a moment and just say that if there are any questions from those who are watching, anybody who is listening, feel free to send your questions and we will address any questions that you ask. But we're going to go ahead and move forward until we have some questions posted. Thank you. Yes, wholeness. Whew. My Black Joy is on 3,000.
Yes, Black Joy. Come on. Something it.
Okay. So, So I have a question and I'm breathing and reconsidering before I ask this question. Because I think it needs some modification in order to do what it should do for our audience. Yes. Being that Blacks have come into senses of self-expression, a sense of knowing, and a sense of becoming in the present today, what should we be looking for and working toward as a collective?
It's so funny because you were just talking about this and this might seem like a facetious answer, but work with me. I think we should be working toward joy and pleasure, quite frankly, because when you really think about it, the one thing that Black people have always had to hide away is their joy. And I was talking to my grandmother, and I think she's watching because she just texted my watch. Oh, hey, Grandma, let me see, bro. I was talking to my grandmother yesterday, and she said, have you ever looked at the pictures of your great-grandmother when she was a child and of your great-great-grandparents? And I said, yeah, I look at it, they look like strong Black people. She's like, yeah. Do you ever see them smile? And I'm like, yeah, sure. But I looked back and I was like, there's no pictures of them smile. She was like, even Frederick Douglass. This mirror is messing me up. Even Frederick Douglass. None of the photos do you ever see Frederick Douglass smile. It's very hard to even find a photo of Thurgood Marshall smile, right? Up until he's on the Supreme Court, right? And he has a type of comfort. But throughout all of Black life, people have had to hide the reality of their big laugh and their joy, because not only was it seen as something if you display it, as if white people will take it away from you and beat it out of you and kill it out of you, but it also said that joy was something so sacred that you just shared it with those that you loved. You just shared it with those that did the work of helping you conjure it. And so what I would like to see, and what I think that we must do, and I think it's a point of the other thing, is Black people having the ability to be joyful, to seek and conjure and experience pleasure, not just in private spaces, right? But at home, in public, out loud. And that Black joy not being seen as a thing that is criminal, not being seen as an encroachment, not being seen as something that must be subdued, put down, and broken. We can think about, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but Barbecue Becky, right? What was she doing? She was concerned and she was annoyed and she was afraid because there was Black people being happy having a barbecue at a public park. Black joy, right? Something that has often been seen as something that is out of place and always already out of place, right? It doesn't belong in public. It's a disturbance. And so I think that once we're able to get comfortable and sit with the fact that our joy is something that cannot and shall not and will not be stolen, but something that is necessary to experience publicly, because joy is not meant to be hidden, then we're also able to take up space in a new way, right? We're not stepping off of sidewalks no more, right? We're not putting our head down or walking across the street when we see a white woman with her purse no more, right? We're not being afraid to go out with our hair looking any type of way. Sorry, Monique, or whatever. You can wear a bonnet, baby. Any type of way. No more. Because the point that you exist, the point that you are human, the point that you are a Black human should be enough, right? And I think joy is the portal to which we can start understanding our ability to own and claim space. So often we are seen and reimagine ourselves or see ourselves being seen as property in need of being placed, right? But not able to own our own spaces.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That is so powerful. I had an experience today and you spoke exactly to that experience. Whew. Yes, I want to throw my shoe. This is to me, it's like a God moment. So I will say today, in the middle of a pandemic, living in New York City, and still having bits of isolation and dealing with what I see on a daily basis, being a Black man. I had to, this morning I woke up and I was like, ooh, joy. And there's this feeling of hopelessness. And I had to spend some time with the Creator in order to reclaim, hope and to reacquire my joy. And part of the reason why I had felt down this morning was because I was thinking about what my value looks like as a recent graduate who does not yet have a full-time job. Though I'm doing nonprofit work and and I have a fellowship and I have some great things going on, but if you're not Black and working, you're no good. And so it was
a Black man without a job. What?
I must be a criminal.
Right. What you doing?
And so, like you said, placement, thinking about, how am I going to fit and what, and I had to kind of get rid of all of that and said, I was born with a value.
That's right.
Value what is attributed based upon me coming here because the Creator made me who I am, how I am. And so I started, so when I realized that, I was like, oh, well, I think I'm Black and I'm brilliant. Right. And I love my people and I'm working to help extricate my people from these systems which disadvantage us. And so I begin to get thankful and reacquire my Black joy.
That is so real. So one of my mentors, Christina Sharp, relayed a quote to me by, what's Zakia's last name? Oh, Lord, I'm going to forget it now. I'll come back to it. But she wrote this book called Being Human. It's Becoming Human. It's amazing about Black people. But anyway, Zakia was asked a question on a panel about Black excellence. And she said, you know what? Black excellence is the wrong answer to a racist question. she said, and I'm paraphrasing and now these are my own thoughts, but what does it mean that Black people must be excellent? What does it mean? And think about where that got beaten into our heads, of course, during slavery. The idea that like Black people can't be mediocre, Black people can't rest, Black people can't be lazy if we want to. Black people must always, 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 right? Produce, to your point, reproduce, be the best or you don't exist. Be the best or you're disposable. It's like Black excellence or Black disposability, right? And so we don't get moments of reprieve. This idea that you're just graduating school and you got to have a job yesterday, right? Like, what does that mean and what toll does that take on the psyche? What does it mean that our Constitution once said, well, really, the Federalist Papers, that we're 3/5 of a person and the remainder being property, and yet we're still talking about Black people in terms of value? What? What is going on, right? That we're still, our lives, right, are still measured in dollars and cents, right? And generally, when we're talking about Black people, we're measured as negative equity, right? We're measured as always being in excess. We're always debt and too much surplus. It's very, very wild. And I really want us to, as Black people, really kind of sit with that. Like, what does it mean that I'm constructed in a way, and the world is constructed in a way where my Black has to be excellent, whereas white people get to be mediocre and still take your job? So like, what do we do with this? And why must we raise our kids in a way where they have to be the very best at all times? Because that excellence blocks the way to joy. Because you can't just try things out. You can't just see how it goes. You can't experiment. You can't be curious because you have to be excellent. So you do what you know you can do. Something else.
That is phenomenal. And so when you talk about our value and how we're reared and our response to that. So you're talking about the internalization of colonialism and those practices. Mm-hmm. And so that makes me think, whenever I looked at a Black or queer, mm-hmm. or a poor person, mm-hmm. and done the same thing.
That's right.
To them.
That's right.
Because it is LGBT history, I've said when Black Lives Matter, when that movement mm-hmm. Started, mm-hmm. I kind of used that as my mantra. Mm-hmm. And so I say that because Black Lives Matter and somebody responded to me harshly, my first response will be grace. I didn't say it was going to be 5 responses of grace. But my first response is grace. And so, that grace looks like different things. And so now when I see a homeless person mm-hmm. that is Black or brown,
oh Lord, yes,
I said, wow, I'm not looking at them. Let me look at them.
That's right.
And engage and acknowledge, humanize. So mm-hmm. that's what that means to me for Black Lives Matter. Humanize Black and brown folks. And what does it mean to? So it means not objectifying. It means not blaming them. It means taking a step back and removing the colonial influence.
That's right. And I mean, even the language you just used, right? We have to be careful because you don't have to humanize anybody. They're already human. Right? What we have to do is not dehumanize them, right? Because that's what we're doing in our gaze. At some point, we see someone and we switch in our mind based upon their value. Because when someone's homeless, first of all, we're identifying them by the lack of having a house. Like, what is wrong with us? A lot, obviously. But I mean, it's just so normative, right? To do that. Like, we don't know this person, but we call them homeless. And that's a shorthand for their value in society, right? And that is very, very kind of disturbing. And I mean, like some of I don't even say, not my friends now, but previous friends always make fun of me because I come from a very working poor, and sometimes not working poor, disabled poor background, right? And I always enjoy going to like the little hole in the wall dive bars because I get to talk to everybody. You know, I'm just like chopping it up. I'm like, you might be my little brother, you might be my uncle or my auntie, like whatever. You know, let's get these little $1 shots. It is what it is. It's well drinks. But when I go there, I learn so much about the world. And so many of my like peers that have PhDs or law degrees or MBA, whatever, don't feel comfortable in those spaces. And it says so much to me about, well, what do you think is going to happen to you? Do you think you're going to lose your value? Do you think this thing is contagious? Do you think that poor people are somehow a danger or, again, a toxin or an infectious disease, airborne or something? Right? Because for me, it's thinking about like James Baldwin. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat we should probably look at, but it's like James Baldwin's essay, The Creative Process, where he talks about the importance of stepping away from your day-to-day life and sitting back and just reflecting on what you witnessed. Not just so you can write a cute book or a poem or a sermon or what have you, but so then you can go back and you can give good testimony, right? You can give good testimony and bear good witness to the reality of the world, to the reality of the constraints and the constructs of folks' lives that make them do what they do, right? And he says, this is the role of the artist, to witness and to testify. But you can't testify. You can't give good and wholesome testimony unless you step back and you've contended with what you just witnessed. And I mean, that's what we're doing here today in our conversation about folks being without a house or being homeless, right? And we're sitting with that language. And what does that mean? And how did we get there, right? And so that's our work. And it's only a 3-page essay. So if y'all ain't read The Creative Process by James Baldwin, please get into it. It's a self-care model. I live by it.
So thank you for that. We're gonna answer one question from the audience, and it asks, is there a time when the Black church, not that it's a monolith, did not have an overt rejection of Black queer people? And is there a way to kind of like discuss the ebb and flow historically?
So this is hard. Y'all love these complicated questions, and I'm here for it. Let's mix it up. Let's stir and sit with it, marinate a little bit. So this is a difficult question because if you think about both slavery and then like the ends of slavery, oftentimes people that were Black and queer would do what? Become preachers. Right? Because one, it was a place where it was usually oftentimes in those times acceptable for the preacher not to yet have a wife, right? Or to be single in the ways that, you know, some of these priests are, right? And it was seen that this person is being chaste. So in that way, a lot of queer folk, right, end up going into the church, one, because we're just great with language oftentimes, and we're inspirational. And again, it goes to earlier when you're the closest to the ground, right? You can see the world for what it is. And so your sermons are then infected and inflicted with the reality of people's affections and inflictions, right, of their world. So you're able to kind of craft and tell the stories of the entire Black community because you're living it all, being who you are, living where you've been and coming from where you're from. So in some ways it's complicated because oftentimes the preachers themselves are queer, right? Or nowadays always the adage is like the minister of music, right? I mean, I was ordained at 15, so I get it. It's a weird space to be in. But at the same time, you really don't have an assault on queerness after the end of slavery and during slavery so much because one, people are not out in that way. And there isn't a language for it. Sometimes you're a little different, sometimes you're a little strange. And these types of stigmas in some places, in some cultures, if you're looking at like Louisiana, New Orleans, things like that, have not been beat into people in the same type of way. So to RJ's point, this is a really hard question to answer because the church is diverse. Black people are diverse. These churches are happening in very different politics and very, very different cities with very different descendants of different African tribes or what have you, or nations rather, in the United States. So that's kind of difficult. What I would say is we really start hearing, though, this kind of, I don't even want to say disdain for queer people, because it didn't start off as gay people are bad. It started off in kind of the words, and see I'm mirrored now, the words of Douglass, again, when he's talking about this need for Black men to be manly, right? Mm-hmm. And this is an echo of the work of Thomas Jefferson. And not manly as in like, you know, there's a disdain against women, but the idea is that if Black men show themselves to actually be men, then we can show we deserve the right to vote. And they cannot deny it to us anymore. right? And so a lot of the early Black respectability that we see in the early church, pre-Azusa Street Revival, pre-1906, all that, right, is this idea, right, this early Black respectability that Martin Luther King starts to popularize and what have you, is that if we work hard enough, if we're honest enough, if we're gracious enough, they will see that we too are human and deserve the right to vote. In fact, it should already be ours. And so a lot of the early kind of fear about, of queer people wasn't about who you're having sex with. More so, it was often about, are you a man in a dress? Really type of transphobia, because that transphobia then might be used, right, to operationalize anti-Blackness and say, ha, there's the reason we can't let them vote. Look at them. They're uncivilized. So much of the phobias, so much of the misogynoir and sexism in our communities actually come out of this place where we're trying to orient ourselves and contort ourselves for the white gaze, so that one, we reduce our targetability and our harmability, but two, we also increase our believability and our credibility to be able to participate in society as full-on human beings, right? So that's not to say that there wasn't ardent, people misreading the Bible and doing this whole Sodom and Gomorrah dance. We know that happens. I mean, there was less literacy there than there is now, and Black pastors then did not have an opportunity to go to a seminary school, right? They didn't have the opportunity to get a master's of divinity, right? They just read what they read, or they knew what they were told. And we know what white folks was telling folk. Slaves, obey your masters, right? So there's a lot going on here. So I don't know that there's this like deep-seated or deeply rooted type of homophobia that is just mass spread. But what I do know, a part of that homophobia, the homophobia that morphs into, comes out of this idea of attempting to be the perfect man and woman for the white gaze, so they can see that there is no difference between you but the color of your skin. Like Martin Luther King, it's not about the color of your skin but the content of your character. That's the argument they were trying to make, and the results are mixed.
This has been illuminating and just amazing. We are gonna have to have you back, Anansi.
It's too much fun.
This was brilliant. I thank you for joining us. I just want to ask if you have one, closing statement or one last thought that you would like to leave our viewers with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I always like to leave people with things to read. So I would always say that, the first thing, of course, is James Baldwin's The Creative Process. Even if you're not a writer, if you're not a creator, I think it's a great way to, one, meditate and center your life, just to have a reset. Wherever you are in your life in this moment, it's always great to take a moment and reset and say, hey, how am I moving? How am I loving? How am I being loved? How am I receiving love? What am I allowing in this space, right? Secondly, I would say Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic, this conversation about pleasure. What does it mean then if your life, and work with me, if your life is actually guided by the pleasure that you receive? And I'm not saying go willy-nilly and throw yourself into a sex party, something crazy. What I am saying, though, what does it actually mean for you to organize your life around the things that make you happy, and not about what you were just told that you must do in order to be valuable, in order to be loved, in order to be safe? So I would leave you with that, to search and to practice being a good witness and giving good testimony, and to also, while you're working through that test and working through that process, to center your joy and your pleasure, because that's how we get to a better space, a freer space, and a space that is full of Black liberation.
Wonderful. I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Anansi, to everyone who has joined us for this rich conversation dealing with our Black and Brown LGBTQ history. And thank you for tuning in. Please join us next month, the third Thursday, and see us here for this conversation. And do not forget to vote. Like, share. Yes.
One thing, I just saw this question. Is there any place where you can get documented LGBT history? Yale has an amazing LGBT history library that you can access these things online. And UT Austin has an LGBT collections online archive that you could access. Sorry.
Yale, and you said UT?
UT Austin, as well as Yale. Both have great Black LGBT libraries and resources. And what's that place in New York?
Oh, the Schomburg.
Yes,
The
yes,
Schomburg, yes. The Schomburg Center.
yes.
Yes. Those are 4 places to the person who asked the question. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Black Lives Matter. Vote. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.